Welcome to this time of sharing as we reflect on the passage from Matthew chapter 22 verses 34 through 46. The passage we're looking at today has to do with the time the Pharisees actually asked Jesus. Of course, they've been asking him lots of questions, trying to snag him into saying something that would incriminate him. And they asked him about the Ten Commandments, which are the most important. And we might remember this passage where Jesus says, of course, the first is love the Lord your God with all your heart, your mind, and your soul. And he says, and the second one is equally as important. Love your neighbor as yourself. Those are such important core messages of core value in our faith. To love God, to love self, to love neighbor, to love all that God has created. But what I'd like to look at today is a little bit different. I want to look at what is lying behind all of this questioning that the Pharisees are throwing at Jesus, and some of the questions that he returns to them. It all has to do with this ongoing effort that the Pharisees are trying to entrap Jesus by setting him up with questions that they're hoping his response will end up condemning him, that he will say something against the law, if there was the Hebrew law or the Roman law, that would eventually end up getting him arrested. And that's what they wanted. They wanted to silence him. Last week I mentioned why such a fuss was being made. You see, Jesus was going around healing. He was sharing the message of God's love with all who he met, this redeeming love. He was teaching what it meant to live an upright life that took the law of Moses, those 10 commandments, seriously. After all, that is exactly what the Pharisees believed in, this law of Moses. The difference, though, is that Jesus was actually out there living it, exemplifying it. At the core, the Pharisees were speaking the same language, but Jesus was living it. The Pharisees had put layer upon layer on top of those laws, so that it was difficult for anyone to really follow the law without creating an error or sinning in some way. The Pharisees went ahead and continued to wrap these 10 commandments in laws that gave them power and ultimately gave them wealth. What Jesus, however, was spreading was this unconditional love. And they didn't like that because it threatened everything that they had built up around them. And so they continued to challenge him, to silence him. So Jesus then asks them a question or two. In this situation here, he turns around and he asks them a question about what their thoughts are about the Messiah, about David, lifting up, as in other times of questioning, their misdirected focus on what is truly important. The Pharisees were great at all the minute details of the law as they interpreted them to be. But to what gain, really? This isn't the first time nor the last time that Jesus would question them and raise up questions that would highlight the absurdity of their fussing over these little details instead of being concerned over the larger, more important things of a faithful heart. Their idea of law and order neglected the basic truth of the laws of love, of loving God and what that means, of loving neighbor, of loving self, and all of the compassion that's wrapped up in that. While the Pharisees were persistent and their efforts eventually they achieved the purpose they were after in silencing Jesus, the truth of the matter is that love has never been silenced, nor ever will be. For as Paul has said in his letter to the Corinthian church, love bears all things, believes all things, hopes all things, endures all things. Love never ends. And then at the end of that, he tags on another line, which I think is really important. He says, now I will show you a more excellent way. And the rest of his letter to the Corinthian church talks about what it means to live in that love, to be that love, exemplify that love, to show respect, acceptance, compassion, kindness, mutual support, honor, integrity, justice, generosity, a pureness of heart. The list could go on. Paul was conveying what Jesus exemplified in his life. Nothing is more valuable than a life of love. Not only saying it, but living it in everything that we say and in all that we do, giving voice along with action. When money becomes more important than compassion, when status more valuable than equal rights and justice and fairness, when materialism more significant than the common good, when self-interest becomes the driving force for what matters, then there is no true fulfillment. There is no true peace. There will be no true harmony. What Jesus taught and emphasized was the elevation of love to the highest aspects of life. Nothing is greater than love. And our demonstration of that love is to value all of creation and all humankind, comprehending that what we do, the choices we make, has an impact on the world and all others in it. Therefore, we are called to live with a global mindset that recognizes and respects all. Gandhi once said, our greatest ability as humans is not to change the world, but to change ourselves. Yes, indeed, he was correct. And yet he knew that what that meant in the long run is that as we change ourselves, indeed the world is impacted and the world is changed for the better. At the center of our faith is the formula for living a full life, a fulfilling life. It's expressed in one word that blankets all the aspects of our lives. Love. Love of God and all that is God's. Our neighbor, ourself, all of creation. Become advocates of love and how we live our lives, and the world indeed will be impacted. But love comes with a price. The price of defending that love wherever and whenever we can. Our faith calls us to do just that. I remember my mother saying so many times, doing the right thing sometimes is often the hardest. It's not easy. And indeed it is not. It sometimes requires us to stand up and speak out. There are times when we are asked to dig deep within ourselves and ask, what would Jesus do in this position? Or in another way, we might say, what is best for all? What is best for all? Not for myself, but for all. I was reminded of a story entitled The Dash. Perhaps you have heard about it. In a nutshell, it refers to that little tiny line that lies between our date of birth and our final day. That dash represents our lives, whether it's 30 years, 40 years, 50, 70, 90, whatever the number. Most importantly is what that dash represents and how we lived our lives. If we were to look at the dash in our lives so far, what would we discover? What would we see about how we've chosen to live our lives, to live our faith? In closing, I reflect on a phrase from AA, that if you take the I in illness and replace it with we, W-E. You get wellness. It serves as a wonderful reminder to those wrestling with addiction that working together is far greater than struggling alone. In that same vein, I would suggest that we are to strive to live our lives as examples of love in this world of great challenge and division. That the illnesses that threaten our society can become a wellness by uniting together for the betterment of all. Let us remember and find hope in the reality that love indeed never ends, and love surpasses all things. Blessings today and always. Amen.